Thank you for the sub. I'm Got Late. This is Chapter 25, The Evolution of John Ramsey's Statements. As noted in previous chapters, investigators were concerned about the discrepancies showing up in the statements being provided by the family. I was interested in tracking the history of the statements to see exactly how they had evolved over time. The following is a synopsis of the statements made by John Ramsey with regard to some of the actions taken on the morning of the discovery of the ransom note. Included are his thoughts about the intruder and suspected point of entry used to access his residence. A more detailed analysis of some of John Ramsey's statements is addressed in a later chapter. The chronological history of John Ramsey's statement, as provided by the initial police investigation on December 26, 1996. John advised investigators that he believed the house had been locked on the evening of December 25, 1996. He indicated that he observed no sign of forced entry to the home. He advised that upon learning of John Benet's disappearance, he checked on Burke's welfare and determined him to be safely asleep in his bedroom. John did not ask Burke if he knew of the whereabouts of John Benet or if he'd seen or heard anything during the night. John stated that he conducted a cursory search of John Benet's bedroom after reading the ransom note, but there was never any mention of a trip to the basement. During questioning by police investigators about possible suspects, John and Patsy provided names and possible motives for suspects, but John did not say anything about his observations and suspicions regarding a possible entry and exit point of the residence. The follow-up interview for the police is on December 27, 1996. Sergeant Larry Mason and Detective Linda Arndt responded to the Fernie residence on the evening of Friday, December 27th, in an attempt to arrange a follow-up interview with the Ramseys, but were told that Patsy was too distraught to answer the questions about the death of her daughter. Ramsey friend and attorney Michael Bunham was present at the Fernie's residence that evening. He wouldn't permit an interview to take place at the police department. Sergeant Mason asked John about the broken window in the basement, and he was told that he had broken it during a forced entry to his home the previous summer when he had left his keys behind. Police investigators were subsequently advised on December 28th that members of the Ramsey family were now being represented by legal counsel. Any questions wished to pose to them would have to be routed through the district attorney's office. CNN interview, January 1st, 1997. Not yet having participated in a formal police interview, the Ramseys decided to involve the national media by providing an interview with CNN in Georgia. John Ramsey stated that he had shared his thoughts with the police and that he intended to return to Boulder to speak with investigators. John Ramsey reported that they were now ready to cooperate. John Ramsey stated that his family were not angry about John Benet's death, but they were interested in finding out why this had occurred. John and Patsy Ramsey pointed to the involvement of an intruder in the death of their daughter, but other than mentioning the ransom note, provided no other details about an intruder's activities in their home. Police interview, April 30th, 1997. Having negotiated the terms of their first official police interview, John Ramsey advised investigators that the garage door was typically used to enter and exit the home. He reported that he had checked the first floor doors and that they appeared to have been locked. John Ramsey stated that he would usually check the back hallway door because it was typically used by the kids to enter and exit the house when playing in the backyard. John reports that he checked on Burke fairly quickly after the discovery of the ransom note and that he was still asleep. John Ramsey reports that he had been to the training room sometime early that morning and observed the broken window, but that he didn't see any glass. The exact timing of this visit was not made clear during the interview, but it was described as being later in the morning after the 911 call to authorities. When he did visit the basement, John assumed that the window was broken from his summer 1996 forced entry to the basement. He reported that the train room window was open approximately 1/8 of an inch. John stated that he closed and latched the window. John reported that he didn't return to the basement until the direction of Detective Arndt. This took place at approximately 1 p.m., and he led Fleet White to the train room and informed him of his previous forced entry into the room. They inspected the window and looked for window glass together. John Ramsey states that the unlatched window probably struck him as a little unusual, but it wasn't dramatically out of the ordinary. He didn't bring it to anyone's attention. John went on to state, "My theory is that someone came in through the basement window because there was a blue Samsonite suitcase also sitting along the right side under the window. The intruder, foreign faction, could have gotten into the house without that, but you couldn't have gotten out of the window without something to step on. Those windows weren't obvious to somebody just walking by." Denver News Media interview, May 1st, 1997, in response to the criticism of the father of murder victim Polly Klaas regarding their lack of cooperation with authorities, John Ramsey reported to the media that they, the Ramsey family, had spoken with police investigators for approximately 8 hours on December 26, 1996, another 2 hours on December 27, 1996, and that they had supplied them with every piece of information they had. John stated that "we have all along, through our investigative group, communicated every piece of information we had that we felt was relevant to the case." Boulder County District Attorney's interview, June 23, 1998. John Ramsey thinks he checked on John Benet's room before Patsy called 911. He stated that there was just a lot of running around going on. John just looked in Burke's room. He was in bed and was asleep. I knew he was there and he was okay. I might have looked around the house some more. I know I looked in the refrigerator. We have this walk-in refrigerator. We're always worried about the kids getting in there. John was perplexed as to how they got in. Later that morning, wondering if anyone else was watching the house, went to Burke's room with binoculars. There was a truck parked in the alley across the road behind the Barnhill residence that I never noticed before. There was a white Ford Fiesta driving by more than once. John Ramsey reported that he had gone to the basement earlier and found the floor to the train room kind of blocked. There was a chair in front of the doors. Window was cracked open maybe an inch. John stated that the Samsonite suitcase against the wall directly under the window. I don't think I looked anywhere else. At that point, I was trying to figure out why they had got in the house. The window was sort of explainable, but the suitcase was unusual. That shouldn't have been there. Regarding his trip to the basement, well, when I came down, one of those things I noticed was, that the door is kind of blocked. There were some boxes and there was a stool kind of thing sitting there. It wasn't obvious to me that someone had gone through there because I had to move a chair to get in, which I did. The window was partially open, but the suitcase just kind of jumped out at me. John states, I absolutely did not put the suitcase back in the train room. Continuation of District Attorney's Office interview, June 24th, 1998. Detective Lou Smith and John Ramsey review photograph number 71, which depicts the entryway to the train room. John Ramsey, what is different? The door is blocked only by this drum table. Here's the chair I said was blocking the door. I moved the chair to get into the door. When I went down, the chair was kind of blocking that entrance right there in the train room door. There was something else on the other side, but all I had to do was move that chair and I walked into the room. Lou Smith, So, do you think that the chair would block the door in an attempt that nobody would have gotten into there without moving it? John Ramsey. Correct. Lou Schmidt. In other words, let's say that the intruder goes into the train room and gets out. Let's say the window. Would he get that chair to block the door? John Ramsey. I go down, I move that chair and went in the room. Lou Schmidt. So you couldn't have gotten in without moving the chair. John Ramsey. Correct. Lou Schmidt. I'm trying to figure out if an intruder went through the door, he'd almost have had to pull the chair behind him, and that would have been his exit. John Ramsey. Yeah, it was blocked. He had to move something to get into the room. Lou Schmidt. And he would have had to move it back if he was in there to go out. John Ramsey. Yeah. Lou Schmidt. So that's not very logical in terms of doing that. John Ramsey. Yeah, I think it is. If this person is bizarrely clever to have left any good evidence, yet left all these funny clues around, they certainly are clever enough to pull a chair back when they left. ABC News interview, March 17, 2000. During the nationally televised interview with Barbara Walters, John Ramsey shares his thoughts regarding the open train room window. I am a bit alarmed, but I was more alarmed with the Samsonite suitcase that was standing up below the window. That looked wrong. That suitcase did not belong there. It was out of place. John's first impression was the kidnapper had gone through the window. Excerpts from the Ramsey book, The Death of Innocence, published on March 2000. Sometime that morning, while awaiting the ransom call, John recalls breaking into the basement train room when locked out of the house that previous summer. While waiting for the ransom call, he remembers that the note indicates the kidnappers will be watching. Hoping to catch them looking at the house, he races upstairs to find binoculars. He observes a strange vehicle in the alley across the street behind the Barnhill residence. After several minutes, nothing has happened and he returned downstairs. The ransom call does not come by 10 o'clock and John's desperation increases. That entry point needs to be looked at. The pane is still broken and the window is open and the large old Samson suitcase is still sitting under it. Odd, I think. This doesn't look right. This suitcase is not normally kept there. Maybe this is how the kidnapper got in and out of our window. The window ledge is a few feet off the floor, so a person would need something to stand on in order to get up and out. Videotape deposition of John Ramsey in civil case 00-CIV-1187 JEC Robert C. Wolf versus John Ramsey, Atlanta, Georgia, December 12, 2001. John Ramsey testified that he went into the basement on one occasion before Detective Arndt asked him to check the residence. He did not remember the time that he made his first trip to the basement. When asked what he does remember seeing in the basement when he went down there, John states, I saw a partially opened window with broken glass and a suitcase beneath the window. When asked if he saw anything else, John responded, not that looked out of the ordinary. Questioned as to why he went to the basement, John states, I was trying to determine how someone could have gotten into our house. John advised that no one directed him to check the basement and doesn't know if anyone saw him go there. He had a vague recollection of mentioning the broken window to Detective Arndt, but he had explained his earlier summer entry to the home. What I found disturbing about the chronology of these statements is that John had failed to mention his observations and suspicions about the suitcase to investigators on the morning of the kidnapping. He had the opportunity to tell Detective Arndt about this after his exploration of the basement. This was a crucial bit of information, especially in light of the fact that everyone in the house was puzzled about kidnappers that had gained entrance into the home that morning. He also neglected to mention these observations to Sergeant Mason the following evening, on December 27, 1996, when officers visited the family to the Fernie residence. Moreover, investigators didn't learn about John's observation of the suspicious vehicles in the neighborhood until June 1998. I am aware that the Boulder Police Department investigators were driving through the neighborhood in unmarked vehicles on the morning of the kidnapping, and they could have easily checked on the identity of the people occupying these vehicles. And then came 1998 revelations, with the suspect was believed to have moved a chair in the basement before escaping the residence. The chair could have yielded latent fingerprints for comparison against the 71 million known offenders maintained in the National IAFIS FBI database. This database is more than 7 times the size of the DNA database. I would have suggested that this would have improved the chances of identifying a suspect if latent fingerprints had been collected from the chair. Despite claims that the family had shared all this information they had to the law enforcement authorities, it was discouraging to bear witness to the wasted opportunities presented in the events chronicled above. Assuming the intruder theory to be valid, it is entirely possible that the case would have been significantly advanced by identifying the people in the vehicles observed by John Ramsey and by the processing of critical evidence that might have been handled by suspects while in the home. Chapter 26, The Christmas Gift. The 2005 Christmas holidays were fast approaching, and for some reason, I felt the necessity of gifting the discoveries of my work in the Ramsey case to the district attorney, Mary Lacey. By that time, I felt that my re-examination had discredited the evidence that suggested an intruder had been responsible for this crime, and indeed that compelled visual evidence pointing the investigation in an entirely new direction. I couldn't understand how Smith so easily dismissed physical evidence and discounted the window well as a point of entry. Spiderwebs attached the grate to the foliage and the window well wall, as well as the cobwebs in the corner of the frame and the placement of the rectangular piece of glass on the exterior windowsill, appeared to preclude anyone's entry or exit from this location. A collection of pine needles and leaves on top of the grate further bolstered this observation. More importantly, the sequencing of the injuries sustained by John Bonet were entirely inconsistent with Smith's versions of events. It was his belief that she had been repeatedly strangled with the garrote, and then she had suffered the blow to her head at or near the time of death. The lack of blood from the external wound apparently accounted for this hypothesis. But it should be noted that the first strike involved a blow to the head doesn't always break the skin of the scalp and cause immediate external bleeding. John Bonet's injury gave the appearance of one massive strike to the top of the right side of her skull. There did not appear to be any follow-up blow, and the severity of her injuries could not be interpreted from a viewing of the external autopsy photographs alone. The severity of the injury to her skull was not realized until after her scalp had been redacted to inspect the internal aspects of her head. It only then became apparent when that she had suffered a crushing blow to her skull. Internal bleeding normally does not occur once the heart stops beating. According to the forensic examiners who studied the evidence, the presence of such bleeding revealed that John Bonet had lived for some period of time after receiving the blow to her head. Moreover, it appeared to me that the garrote had been applied in one singular fashion and not repeatedly tightened during an orgy of torture. Dr. Spitz's opinion about the collar of the shirt causing the other abrasions on John Bonet's neck seemed consistent with the appearances of those injuries. Although I thought it was possible that the perpetrator could have repeatedly tightened and loosened the garrote during an episode of torture, I wondered why someone would do that to an unconscious child. This activity would not have resulted in the victim regaining any semblance of consciousness and would not likely have provided the intruder any degree of satisfaction. The intent of torture is to see the victim's fearful reaction to pain and physical torture, and that was not possible in this set of circumstances. It was a matter of speculation on my part, but I believe the cord of the garrote had been tightened during one single application. The hair that was caught in the knot of the garrote, located at the base of her neck, would likely have been torn free from John Bonet's scalp during a repeated loosening and tightening of a ligature. As noted by the coroner, the final application of the garrote was the proximate cause of her death. I couldn't help but wonder if Smith had reviewed any of the forensic findings when he constructed his theory of the intruder. His hypothesis was contrary to the forensic science developed over the course of the investigation. My interpretation of some of the physical injuries suggested that an entirely different series of events had taken place and that they were in direct contradiction to what Smith was proposing. There were other aspects of the kidnapping that didn't quite ring true, and it was my belief that careful consideration of all these pieces of evidence and clues would help steer the investigation back on course. A fairly substantial PowerPoint presentation was nearing completion, and I was preparing to sit down with my boss to spell out the details of my efforts. I was patiently aware that I was wading into dangerous territory. Mary Lacey didn't believe that the parents had been involved in the death of their daughter. And then my phone rang. Jane J. Harrington, town manager of Tellerud, and my former employer, was calling to see if I was tired of my current position. He indicated that the chief police of Tellerud, in place for less than a year, was preparing to move on to bigger and better things. Harrington wanted to know if I was willing to consider the possibility of returning to my old desk. Here I was, on the eve of committing political suicide, being offered an opportunity to return to the safe haven of the mountains of southwestern Colorado. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony of the situation. I could be fired the next day for expressing my professional opinion about the murder investigation, and out of the blue came another job offer. How fortuitous was that? I ended up postponing my presentation to Lacey and her staff, scheduled for the next day, so that I could add a few more video clips that would help round out my case theory. When I ultimately presented my theory on January 30th, 2006, I wasn't terminated. I didn't really think that was going to happen, but the events that followed seemed to suggest that I had fallen out of favor. Chapter 27, January 2006 presentation. I had worked on the PowerPoint presentation for approximately 2 months and was finally prepared to share my findings with Mary Lacey and her command staff at the end of January 26. It had been a long haul, but I felt that I had prepared a fairly comprehensive investigative piece that placed the lone intruder theory into question. There were a number of elements that comprised the foundation of my theory, and the key to these discoveries was the belief that I had effectively discontinued the evidence that suggested an outsider was responsible for this crime. The court documents, photographs compiled by Boulder investigators, had eventually revealed their secrets. My presentation consisted of a number of stills, 35mm photographs, and video segments that would help illustrate my hypothesis. Closer examination of the crime scene video completed by Boulder crime scene investigators on the evening of December 26, 1996, virtually eliminated the possibility that entry had been made to the Ramsey residence through the train room window well. This video provided more detailed information about the condition of the window well than what had been depicted in the 35mm still photographs. I then moved forward to examine the theory that a stun gun had been used to silence JonBenet. Notwithstanding the fact that Boulder County Coroner John Mayer reported the undermined marks on JonBenet's to be abrasions versus burn marks, DA investigators conducted their own comparison of the most likely brand of stun gun alleged to have been used in the assault. One-on-one photographs comparing the stun gun probes to the injuries on JonBenet had not yet been prepared. However, I asked that this be done. A series of PowerPoint photographs were completed that revealed the measurements of the electronic probes and that they did not match the injuries on the body of JonBenet. It was related to me that the high-tech boot print in the wine cellar was potentially from a number of sources and not necessarily left by an intruder. Additionally, by the time I arrived by the investigative scene, the FBI laboratory had already conducted random DNA tests on underwear purchased off the shelf. They determined that DNA samples could be obtained from new unopened packages of children's underwear, suggesting the possibility that a genetic material deposited there had come from the manufacturing packaging end of the line. I thought it would be a small step from there to conduct additional tests that simulated a coughing, sneezing, spitting seamstress handling of similar items and a very specific type of DNA that could be collected from the fresh off the shelf clothing articles. Under those circumstances, I believe that there may have been plausible explanation for the DNA found in the underwear and that this presence may have had nothing whatsoever to do with the death of JonBenet. Its presence was puzzling, but I felt that this single piece of DNA evidence had to be considered in light of all other physical, behavioral, and statement evidence that had been collected over the course of the investigation. Having eliminated the train room window as a likely point of entry and exit and ruling out the use of a stun gun in this abduction, I was left pondering the question of motive. If the intruder was not responsible for the murder of JonBenet, then what possible reason could the Ramseys have had for brutally murdering their daughter? I didn't quite buy the hypothesis that Patsy had lost her temper and struck JonBenet. She had not been eliminated as the author of the ransom note, which certainly left open the possibility that she had been involved in the crime. I just didn't reconcile with the fact that Patsy was, by all accounts, a loving and doting mother, and I had difficulty envisioning her ever brutalizing either of her children. Nevertheless, that was one of the questions I contemplated as I began to study the behavioral aspects of the family. A necessary part of the process required an examination of motives presented in the crime. On the face of it, this was the crime that involved mixed motives, and the slide presentation I produced for Mary Lacey and her command staff was entitled A Tale of Two Motives. I cited material from the FBI Crime Scene Classification Manual and the National Center of the Analysis of Violent Crime to spell out the details of these motives. The first involved a crime of kidnap that was the motive identified as criminal enterprise. There had been a taking of hostage that was to be held for ransom. Aside from the missing victim, the ransom note was the most obvious element for this motive, and it spelled out the monetary figure demanded by the perpetrators. But then things took a different twist. The object of the kidnap was never removed from the home. Additionally, the lengthy note suggested an intimate knowledge of the family, and it seemed reminiscent of a Hollywood version of a crime. Agents of the FBI consulted on the case thought the note to be extremely unusual. It had been their experience that kidnappers didn't typically want to reveal details about themselves. Ransom notes were short and sweet. We have your kid. We want $1 million. Wait for our call. Period. Yeah. The FBI had also advised Boulder investigators after the discovery of JonBenét's body that they needed to take a closer look at the family. Statistically, a child found murdered in the home usually involves a family member. FBI agents shared another word of advice. The circumstances surrounding this crime led them to believe that two hands were involved in this murder. The second motive present, quite obvious due to the violence perpetrated against JonBenét, was identified as sadistic murder, sexual homicide. The injuries inflicted upon JonBenét left little doubt about what this motive was. All things considered, there were entirely different and contrasting motives that seemed to defy explanation. If there truly was a group of people intending on extorting ransom from John Ramsey, why would they murder the object that held value in their cause? If JonBenét had been killed by accident, why not remove her from the home and follow through with the ransom call? They could have collected the money and the family would never have been aware that their daughter was already dead. The other question posed to address the sexual sadists. If the motivation for this crime involved a lone sexual perpetrator, why would he not remove the object of his desire from the home? Pedophiles who abduct children typically take them somewhere private where they can take their time abusing their prey. He instead took the risk of being discovered and trapped by assaulting JonBenét within the confines of the residence. And for what purpose did he take precious time to craft a ransom note? Based upon neighbors' observations, it appeared he may have written the note beneath the dimming lights of the kitchen. From there, I outlined the factors that pointed to a mixed offender profile, a technique used to help police narrow down a pool of suspects possibly involved in a case. The confusing circumstances present in this crime suggested that we had both an organized and disorganized offenders responsible for its commission. Some of these clues present suggested that the organized offender was responsible for this crime. He/they were methodical and had appeared to have conducted surveillance of the home before the kidnapping. According to the ransom note, they also appeared to be familiar with the family. Implements used in the crime, i.e. the cord, the duct tape, were not found in the home after the discovery of the body, so it was presumed that they had brought these items with them, a sign that thought had gone into the process and pre-planning of this event. On the other hand, the disorganized aspect of the case involved the use of Patsy's notepad and pen in the construction of the ransom note, as well as the uses of the paintbrush and the garrote. Some of these items collected from the scene, perhaps last minute, had suggested that no planning or forethought had gone into the process. Taking time to craft this note unnecessarily exposed the perpetrator to discovery and capture, the sign of an unsophisticated and disorganized mind. I felt that the presence of these mixed motives and offender profiles raised doubt about the involvement of a lone sexual perpetrator. In addition, an additional part of the presentation included an examination of the crime scene characteristics, raised the issue of staging, and the behavioral analysis aspects of undoing. The crime classification manual describes staging as activities that someone may engage in when they purposefully alter a crime scene prior to the arrival of police. Elements of staging rises red flags for the investigator because an offender who stages a crime scene usually makes mistakes because they prepared in a way that they think a crime scene should look. Law enforcement officers respond to hundreds of crime scenes over the course of their careers and have developed a sixth sense that sends off alarm bells when something doesn't look or sound right. They recognize that a crime scene will often contain these red flags in the form of inconsistencies. There are two reasons someone may engage in staging a crime scene. One, they wish to redirect the investigation away from the most logical suspect. Or number two, protect the victim or the victim's family. This could include a motive to avoid embarrassment or criminal charging based upon the underlying circumstances present in a crime. The specific acts committed by the perpetrator in this case that gave the impression of staging were the circumstances surrounding the application of the wrist binding and the duct tape. By their very nature, wrist binding are presumed to be used for resistance and control, especially in a situation involving a kidnapped hostage. Yet the wrist bindings were applied so loosely that John Ramsey was able to remove one in a matter of seconds upon discovering his daughter's body. Moreover, the wrists were not bound together, and the length of the cord, 15.5 inches, that separated her hands offered no protection from efforts that may have been made to remove the duct tape. Dr. Meyer, the coroner conducting the autopsy, noted that the binding remained on one of JonBenét's wrists was loose enough for him to slip a finger beneath the cord. It seemed apparent that these bindings were not intended to restrain JonBenet, but may have been applied for another purpose. To demonstrate the nature of a true binding utilized in a kidnapping, I obtained photographs of the injuries sustained to the wrist of Tracy Neff, a 7-year-old child abducted on March 16, 1984, from the exterior of her school in Thornton, and whose body was recovered later that day in Boulder County. In this instance, there were ligature marks found on Tracy's wrists, right elbow, and face. The bindings used to create these marks had been removed prior to the discovery of her body. Investigators noted that there were linear marks along her cheeks that suggested that she had been gagged, and there were distinct marks on her wrist that indicated that she had been bound by some type of rope and cord. The purpose of this comparison was to point out the distinction between binding and that had been applied for the brutal purposes of control and restraint, and those that have been applied for another reason. Tracy's wrists bore the marks of rope that had been applied for significant force. In JonBenét's case, the bindings were so loose that they could inflict no marks upon their wrists. Were these utilized for restraint and control, or in the staging of the crime with the intention of misleading investigators? Duct tape placed over the mouth of the victim performs the function of silencing them and preventing them from calling out for help. Autopsy reports revealed mucus on the face of JonBenet in the area beneath the placement of the tape. The interpretation of these observations and the physical symptoms that would have accompanied her death suggests that the tape had been placed on her face after death. Conceivably, this was another potential aspect of staging. The psychology behind the concept of undoing specifies that certain acts taken at a crime scene are usually based on the attitude of caring and remorse. Undoing is an action taken by an offender who has a close association with the victim, and they tried to symbolically undo the homicide. Examples of such actions have included washing a victim, placing a pillow under the victim's head, and covering the victim with a blanket. JonBenet had been found wrapped in a blanket, bundled like a papoose, according to her father. Her favorite pink Barbie nightgown was with her. The violent blow to her head, taken in combination with her strangulation and vaginal assault, suggested that a ruthless, cold-hearted individual was responsible for her murder. The caring manner in which JonBenet had been wrapped in a blanket, however, stood in direct contrast to the acts of violence Whoever took time to wrap her up like a papoose was expressing care and compassion for this child. I believe that these were additional elements that conflicted with the accepted assumptions about circumstances surrounding JonBenét's death. I entirely understood the FBI's opinion that more than one person had participated in this crime. The more significant piece of evidence that suggested this crime scene had been staged was the ransom note. Boulder investigators were not willing to let go of the fact that Patsy could not be eliminated as the author, and I was right there with them. Strengthening their suspicions was a peculiar fact that it had been written on her notepad kept in the kitchen. A pen found in the same area was identified as the instrument used to write the note. Moreover, there were remnants of what appeared to be a practice note and missing pages from the tablet. In considering the components of this theory, I took into consideration Lou Smith's perspective regarding this loving Christian family. I asked the following: did John or Patsy have any motive to intentionally murder their daughter? I believe the likely answer to that question was no. I then pondered the theory of the death that had been an accident. Was it possible that Patsy lost her temper during an argument with JonBenet and struck her with an object? It was clear that someone had struck a blow to the head of JonBenet, but it was not and that it had not been self-inflicted. If it wasn't Patsy, then who? The next question that had been considered were then the following: if the parents didn't intentionally kill their daughter, and if there was no intruder, then why go through all this effort of staging a cover-up? Who would benefit? Who was being protected? Why? It had been my experience that the interpretation of a crime involved an understanding of dynamics and psychology of human behavior. As humans, our behavior tends to reveal our motives, and we all behave for specific intent and purpose. We are driven by our desires and our objectives. Determining motive demands more than a simple task of following the physical evidence. Uncovering motive involves careful evaluation of all the elements associated with the crime. Solving a crime requires a comprehensive, objective interpretation of both the physical evidence and the human behavior associated with the events under investigation. The presentation of my PowerPoint theory began at 1300 hours, 1 p.m. on the afternoon of January 30th, 2006. Materials contained within the presentation included crime scene photos, a variety of video clips from police interviews and media coverage, as well as discussion of some of the physical evidence that had been collected over the course of the investigation. A significant number of slides detailed statements that had aspects of motive and opportunity were discussed at length. The clock was closing in on 1900 hours, which is 7 p.m. Mary and the members of her command staff, Pete McGuire and Bill Nagel, had listened intently and asked pertinent questions over the course of the afternoon. But I could tell their attention was fading. We had not taken a break during the entire 6 hours, and there were approximately 50 slides of material yet to be shown. I decided it was time to cut to the chase. I pointed out that John Ramsey's attorney had effectively withheld medical records from the prosecution during the investigation, and I specifically referred to John Ramsey's interview of June 1998. I felt that given the above information, we should be revisiting and intensifying our investigation of the involvement of the family. Among other things, we should be seeking the psychiatric records of Burke to determine if he had any knowledge of the death of his sister, either through a grand jury or by asking the Ramseys for information. I believed wholeheartedly that this was a viable investigative lead that deserved pursuit. If nothing came from it, then at least we could say that we had covered all our bases. Mary Lacey's response is something that I will have difficulty forgetting. She told me that she was unwilling to pursue that lead because she didn't want to harm her relationship with the Ramsey family. Mary Lacey's response is something that I will have difficulty ever forgetting. She told me that she was unwilling to pursue that lead because she didn't want to harm her relationship with the Ramsey family. This response left me speechless, and I effectively ended the presentation. At this juncture, I felt that nothing more could be done or said that could sway Mary Lacey from this position. As I packed up my computer and projector, she told me something that Tom Wickman had purportedly observed during the execution of the search warrants of the Ramsey home. He reportedly had observed the impression of someone's buttocks in the carpet of the hallway outside of John Bonet's second floor bedroom. It appeared that someone had been sitting on the floor with their knees up around their chest, leaning against the wall/cabinets. Wickman purportedly told her that he thought it were an intruder that had been waiting while the family was in the white dinner party. I was aware that some intruder theorists believed the possibility of the perpetrator having entered the home while the family was away that evening, and that he had written the ransom note while awaiting their return. Apparently, Mary Lacey thought that Wickman was suggesting that the intruder had found some time to sit on the floor outside of John Bonet's bedroom after penning his note. I didn't recall anything like that in any of the police reports, and I had read and subsequently asked Wickman about it. He told me that he had no idea what I was talking about. Okay. Question. You guys all have my Instagram. Feel free to follow me, or if you just want to message me, we're voting. Which book do you want to read next? I got time. Okay. So we have the book written by Detective Steve Thomas. Highly recommend. I did read this book twice. And Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. I will include the Hallmark movie in your Got Late playlist. On another note, thank you, Reddit. That's what's up. 5,000 views, that's a lot. That's so many people. I don't understand what's happening. Okay, do me a favor. I am unemployed. I left my job after some loser American manager asked me why I'm working 5 days a week when I'm that disabled. Today's not the best day. I got a lumbar issue, but I'm walking around. I love it. I like being around you guys. Sorry, I'm so angry today. Okay,